all of this really is part of our data services that the library provides. We provide consultations and help to students, workshops. We work with faculty on meeting their goals and their courses around data. And all of this really links to the campus's commitment to preparing students for careers, including those in the nonprofit sector, like today, or fields in journalism, law, medicine, whatever. And one of the things that we want to stress for the students on the call is it doesn't matter what major what your major is at Georgia State. It could be in the humanities or the social sciences, or you could be thinking about going to law school or being a journalist like Stephannie Stokes on our call today. You may think of any of these. All these careers benefit from gaining skills and knowledge while you're at Georgia State on how to use data, analyze data, visualize data, et cetera. And so I want to put in a plug for our research data services team right here. Here are some of our team members and their contact information. If you're interested in learning more or in building your data skill set up, we'd love to talk to you and invite you to our workshops. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley Rockwell, who is our Public Interest Data Literacy Fellow. Ashley is also a PhD candidate here at Georgia State with interest in inequity, pedagogy, and data literacy. So Ashley, take it away, and thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. As Brian mentioned, this is part of the Public Interest Data Literacy Initiative, and PIDLIT is what we call it for short, is focused on expanding programs that are promoting data literacy for the public good and building a more diverse pipeline of students who are pursuing careers that are using data skills. In particular, our goal is to reach first-year students because those are students who haven't made up their mind about what they want to do yet, but we want to reach anyone who is interested in building their data literacy skills and also incorporating their data skills with doing things for the public good, working on public interest and social problems. So today I am really excited about our talk because we're going to be hearing from folks that are all focused on housing inequity, but in different ways, and have all had to use data for that. And so we're going to talk with Stephannie Stokes, who's a reporter at WABE, who focuses on housing inequity, Lindsey Siegel, who's the director of housing advocacy at Atlanta Legal Aid, and Sarah Stein, who's an advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and also helped develop the Atlanta Region Eviction Tracker. So I'm going to go ahead and get started so we can allow the panelists to introduce themselves. And so how this panel is going to work is it'll be kind of broken up into 3 sections. We'll have the panelists introduce themselves, and then I will start asking questions, but also we want to have questions from our audience, from the attendees. So if you have any questions, be sure to put them in the Q&A box, and I will try to relay those questions to the panelists throughout the session, but also towards the end when hopefully we have time to get to more bulk of those questions. So I want to start out with allowing the panelists to introduce themselves and how they got into using data, and also to give a brief summary about the work you do related to eviction and equity theft and data. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Stephannie.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I'm a journalist in Atlanta. I work for the public radio station WABE, and I have been there 7 years now, and my beat has evolved over the years, but for the last few I've covered housing, mainly in the Atlanta area. And for me, with housing, I usually do take an equity lens. I focus on issues affecting low-income homeowners or low-income renters. So that means foreclosures or evictions, or this series that we did late last year about this phenomenon called equity theft. And I use data to the extent that I can with my skill set. So I always find that it helps helps the story have more impact, because people can see that it's not just one, the issue is not just affecting one person, but possibly, you know, it's happening across the city, or it's happening to this whole population. Yeah, I'm always learning new skills. With the series that we'll be talking about a little bit today, I did have help from a data reporter who had more precise data skills. But yeah, I definitely do what I can to bring that into my reporting.
Lindsey, did you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure, I'm Lindsey Siegel. As Ashley said, I'm the Director of Housing Advocacy at Atlanta Legal Aid. I'm a lawyer, and I mainly litigate housing cases, both in state court and in federal court. We focus a lot on the types of cases that will resolve historic issues of discrimination in the city, people who are being taken advantage of by either their landlords or folks who are, I do a little bit on the equity theft side. In fact, I worked with Sarah Stein on a case for equity theft. But what we've seen, I think, in my work is that a lot of private equity, especially, came into the city around the housing crisis in 2008. They bought up a lot of properties. They took advantage of people who were in horrible situations. And now a lot of my clients, who are mostly renters, are renting from a lot of those equity firms. And we're seeing things play out, and we're sort of starting to track some of the data around who owns these properties and what their eviction practices are. So happy to talk more about that as part of this panel, but I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. And Sarah?
So I am Sarah Stein. I'm an advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. I sit on our community economic development team, and I focus on housing. Before I became an advisor just under 2 years ago for the Atlanta Fed, I was an attorney. I was one of Lindsey's colleagues at Atlanta Legal Aid. And I, worked mostly on issues of home, like I was on the home defense team there. So focused on issues involving ownership for homeowners, and saw firsthand a good number of cases that involved this concept of equity theft. I don't know if our unit coined that term, but we were the first ones I ever heard using it. So Stephannie may know more about the history of the term than I do. But yeah, so I have that sort of firsthand experience as an attorney representing people who were being targeted to sell their homes for less than what would normally be considered fair market value. And then also, folks that got embroiled in that process and trying to help them get out of it. Many of them not even really understanding what had happened. And so that's one way that I kind of interfaced with equity theft as a researcher, research advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. That was one of the projects that's kind of like top on my list when I came here. And then to do some more in-depth research into equity theft as a phenomenon across our district. And for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, our district includes Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and parts of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee. So a good chunk of the Southeast. But of course, now in that position, I'm a little bit more focused on information and data collection and analysis, and getting that information out to communities across our district. But I also intersect with the issue as a person who lives in Atlanta. I get nonstop phone calls and text messages asking if I will sell my house to someone who always, when I do engage with them, now I just pick up and hang up. They always like offer some, they hesitate to offer a value, and then the value that like they when I offer a value that I think would be fair, they're always like, are you sure that that's what you want to offer? And I'm like, yep. So, so the issue kind of intersects a number of different experiences that I've had professionally and personally, equity theft. And then of course at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, given sort of the pandemic and a lot of concerns around affordability for renters, when, what began as a deep public health crisis became a deep economic crisis, we started trying to figure out ways to collect information about the stability of renters, in particular low-income renters or renters who were losing income. And that's when we worked with the Atlanta Regional Commission and Georgia Tech to develop the eviction tracker that I'm sure we'll discuss more about.
Thank you. Thank you all for introducing yourself, and thank you for being here. I want to start out with, and you've all referenced it, but I want to make sure that everyone understands what equity theft means. And so, Stephannie, your reporting on equity theft actually resulted in the Atlanta City Council writing legislation in attempts to combat what Sarah was talking about, to ban commercial harassment. So I was wondering if you could kind of discuss what those terms mean, both equity theft, and I know Sarah kind of explained a little bit about the commercial harassment, but can you kind of put that in context of what those terms mean and what people that you've been interviewing and working with are experiencing?
Yeah, and yeah, it is really exciting to be on this panel with Sarah and Lindsey because I work with both of them a lot, and Sarah specifically helped me a lot with the beginning stages of this project, which ended up lasting like 2 years. So Sarah was still at Atlanta Legal Aid at the time and worked with one of the women who was at the center of one of my stories. But yeah, sort of like Sarah alluded to, the idea in Atlanta with equity theft is that you have homeowners in neighborhoods where property values used to be really low for different reasons. These were longtime Black neighborhoods that were disinvested over decades, but now maybe they're near the Beltline or some other kind of economic development project, and those property values are rising and there's a lot more interest in the neighborhoods. So what's happening is that investors are sending out flyers, they're going door to door, and they're asking homeowners if they can buy their homes now. What homeowners might not realize is that those property values have risen, and that means that they have more equity in their home. And equity is the profit that homeowners could make when they sell their home. And so they don't realize that basically, yeah, everything around them has been lifted up, and they're still, they see maybe an offer for like $10,000 or $30,000, and it might sound good based on whatever their circumstances are, and they accept it from the investor, or in some cases, they're tricked by the investors, or they're harassed and persuaded. There's all different sorts of mechanisms that I found that this happens. And the reason why you call that equity theft is because the investor is basically taking that equity that the homeowner could have benefited from. Atlanta Legal Aid will say they're stealing it. And yeah, Atlanta Legal Aid definitely helped me use this term. I've seen it around the country a little bit, but not really in this specific type of case. And I do think it's why the story had so much impact. I think it's something that, when you explain it that way, people really get it. And commercial harassment, I think, is just a different way of talking about it. That's like, investors going door to door, making phone calls, sending out flyers. That's how the city council described it. Yeah. And so the city council legislation does make it illegal for investors to contact people multiple times to buy their home after they've already said no. It's like it's $1,000 fine, and I don't think a lot of people still really know about the legislation, but it is a start.
And to be clear, that wouldn't stop multiple people contacting homeowners. So they could still be getting, tons of what we could be defining as harassment, but if it's not from the same person who they've said no to, then it wouldn't count for this commercial harassment that's part of the Atlanta City Council legislation?
Yeah, it's a really tough issue to to work on, and I think Atlanta Legal Aid, they said that they had seen their cases rise over the years, but they were very clear that they did not think that they were getting all of the cases where this was happening, because it means that people have to know that they lost out value on their home, or that something happened that wasn't right, and then they have to know that they could contact an attorney, and this is happening often to like the most marginalized homeowners in the city.
And I would just add one thing about equity theft, that when I sat in the position of being an attorney, really drove home that aspect of equity that could have been one person's and magically became another's. And that is this double closing that you can see in the property records, right? And so what would happen is somebody would come to the closing table, a homeowner would come to the closing table, the person who they had been talking to might be at that closing table, and then immediately thereafter, and maybe even at the same table, you would have another closing where the person that they sold the property to would immediately sell the property to another party for $30,000, $50,000 more, right? And so and that second person who gets the property may also be getting it at what you might consider less than a fair market value. But that amount of money and that double closing right there on that exact same day was just, that really stood out to me as a sort of obvious knowledge gap, right? The homeowner had the second person just come to them and offered them the dollar amount that they offered the first person, probably would have accepted that amount since it was more than the one that they did accept. And I think, there are arguments that people might make about the value of the middleman. But, from my seat at Legal Aid, I saw the value of the home and the fact that the home at the beginning of all this belonged to the person who sold it. So.
Lindsey, did you want to add to how we're defining equity theft and the various issues that you've seen arise with your clients and what you've seen at Atlanta Legal Aid?
I don't really work on the home ownership side of things. I worked on a case with Sarah called Harbor Portfolio that sort of had this combination, almost like there was eviction issues and home equity issues tied in. And we used data a lot in that case, actually. So I think we could probably talk about that. But that's the only case where I really dealt with homeowners. And that case arose from a group of families that Atlanta Legal Aid represented, 23, I think, different families that Atlanta Legal Aid represented, brought a case in federal court against a company that had essentially tricked individuals who were looking to own homes and were promised this dream of home ownership. They were tricked into entering into something called a contract for deed, which is something that's, you're not really a tenant, but you're also not a traditional homeowner because you don't actually have the deed to your own home. And the moment that you fall behind on the payments to the person who does hold the deed, they try to evict you like a tenant. And there are these protections that we have in Georgia, although not many, that set out a certain process for people when they fall behind on their mortgages. And as bad as those processes are, it's much worse to even be a tenant because the process is even worse. So a lot of folks were being threatened with eviction. Some, in fact, even were evicted. And all the money they had paid for these homes, all the money they had been paying every single month was just gone. They thought that they were building equity in their home, and it was just gone overnight. So maybe, Sarah, you can say more about sort of how data was used in that context, because I thought it was fascinating what we learned about how this company was targeting certain communities through the use of data.
Absolutely. Yeah, Lindsey, that's an excellent point and case that folks might find interesting. So as Lindsey mentioned, that was that was a handful of clients that walked into the office, back when you walk into an office, and they thought that they had like a payment dispute with their mortgage servicer, which was a common thing that we would get in the doors. And in fact, when we started looking into their documents, which is sort of a basic thing that we would do in the unit, and the unit still does without me, we found that that these weren't mortgages at all. That in fact there weren't deeds. No, these folks who thought they owned their homes did not in fact have a deed to their home, did not have a mortgage, because documents like that, they appear in the deed records. And that's, you know, the deed records here we can think of as a data source, right? And so when we started seeing this a few times over, and we started asking people, who'd you buy this house from? Like, and people would tell us that they had bought their house from this specific company, and actually they had been referred by a cousin or a friend, or, you know, so actually among our 23 plaintiffs, they were actually a bunch of people who were related to each other because they had referred one another to this home buying program, so to speak. And so as they came in, you know, when you have a familiarity with Atlanta geography, you know, we started kind of seeing similarities around where these homes were located. And I recall in a meeting just being like, I need to see a map. And so what we did was, in probably, you know, now the sort of data science people that I work with would think that this was like crazy that we did it like this, but we just kind of went one by one through, you know, property records, and tried to find like a list, try to make a list of all of the homes that were owned by this entity or entities that were affiliated with it. And then we mapped them, right? We kind of, I did this like very rudimentary map. I can't even remember the website I used. And we were like, okay, we need to overlay this with a map of, you know, racial composition in Atlanta, because this is probably a fair housing case, right? Like this doesn't smell right at all. And so that's what we, you know, that's kind of how we started. And so we had this list of where the properties were, and we had a handful of clients at that point. I think we might have had 5 or 7 clients. And so we started reaching out to the people on the list to understand more about what was going on. You know, like, were all these properties that we were getting on this list, were they really properties that were in the same category as the properties of the clients that we had? So doing that kind of investigation to see if there really was a case there. And we found that, in fact, you know, the name of the property owner was a very good indicator for the use of this contract for deed instrument. And so that, you know, now I might call that like ground checking, or, you know, sort of that process of seeing if the data indicator that you're using really communicates what you think it does. We went through that, you know, from the perspective of attorneys trying to investigate a case. And then we engaged a data expert to then do some deep analysis, some very strong statistical analysis that could hold water in court, and show that, you know, based upon the legal arguments that we were making, there was some presumption that race had to be involved. And so basically what we did was we compared racial composition of, I think, census tract in the areas where these properties were located, and the concentration of the location of the properties, and, you know, sort of controlled for all kinds of other factors. And the statistical analysis pointed out that statistically, it was very likely that race had something to do with this, and had a big part in it, that you almost couldn't say it didn't. And so what that did was that helped us get over the hurdle of a motion for summary judgment, which is, so we brought the litigation already knowing that that analysis, right? And then got to the point where the other side, you know, this motion for summary judgment is basically when they're like, you don't have a case, you know, and they're like, judge, tell them they don't have a case. And so the judge was like, well, actually, they have a case. And that led to some really important settlements that stabilized a lot of our clients in extremely important ways. Many of them ended up with title to their home outright, or with very low balance mortgages, actual mortgages and actual deeds. And then, you know, others with, you know, money that they could use to restabilize themselves. So, so data was essential. We would never have gotten past the motion for summary judgment, and likely would not have had the ability to make those settlement agreements for our clients. And, you know, that's what our clients wanted. I mean, certainly if they had wanted to continue litigating the case, we could have gone down that road. But, you know, litigation can be very exhausting, not just for lawyers, like for clients. So, so yeah, so without the data, we would never have been able to get there.
That is really interesting, and I think that it kind of brings me into my next question. I feel like Sarah's kind of covered it a bit, but I wanted to ask all of the panelists about how does data help you do your job, and then also what kind of data do you wish you had access to, or that did exist, that would help you, you know, be more successful in your job, or to make your job easier, or make it easier for you to understand what's going on. And I want to start with Stephannie. I know that while just trying to figure out all the equity theft issues and just trying to get access to housing data in and of itself can be a difficult thing to deal with.
Yeah. So with the equity theft series, this is something I talked to Sarah about like right away. Is like I knew that there were these anecdotes, these stories of this happening to homeowners in Atlanta that would come up in like community meetings or in her own cases. But I was wondering if we could show that it was happening, you know, how widespread the issue really was. And so yeah, first got into the property records and saw where sales were happening and like where maybe there were artificially low prices. And that's definitely where you start to see these double closings that Sarah was talking about, where you can see obviously like a home selling for 10,000 that morning and then later the afternoon for 70,000. Like something's going on there that's weird. But a lot of those double closings are happening outside of they're not recorded in property records. So the issue is even bigger than that. So we ended up getting help from a GSU professor, Dan Immergluck, and he gave us the idea to find an estimate of fair market value over time, something we could look back and say, okay, a home was sold 5 years ago. What was the estimated value at that time? And the most widespread one is Zillow. So we started this long process of asking Zillow for their for use of their estimate. And after like a year of negotiations, they ended up giving us the data for Atlanta over like a 10-year period or something. So the data reporter helped me compare home sale prices in Fulton County to these point in time estimate data that we had. And through that, we were able to pick out all the properties that were selling for way below fair market value and see where were they in the city, where were they concentrated. And it was mainly low-income Black neighborhoods, especially in gentrifying neighborhoods. And through that, I was also able to call some of the homeowners in those records and find stories for the radio piece. But that was really difficult to reach people because they'd left their home and they didn't have their landline anymore. But I was able to talk to several people and hear their stories, and a couple of them did make it into the radio piece. So yeah, data really helped with that story, and I think it's part of why it had an impact. With the eviction records, I also this last year have been tracking eviction records on my own, and additionally also relying on what Sarah does at the Atlanta Fed. And those have been really helpful in identifying landlords that are filing the most evictions. I did a couple stories about that, including ones who were receiving government relief at the same time, and just sort of explaining to people this like mismatch and help at the federal level, and also using eviction records just to find good stories. So yeah, data has been very helpful.
And for folks who haven't heard Stephannie's story, we've shared it on our Twitter account, and the chat's not open, but I should be able to, I'll try to put it in the Q&A. But if you're interested in listening to Stephannie's story about eviction theft, there's a link to it on our Twitter account, and I'll be retweeting that in just a moment so that way everyone can have access to it. So Lindsey, I wanted to the similar question about how do you use data, or how can data help you with your work, or what kind of data do you wish you had access to, or that was easier to get access to? So like Stephannie said, in some cases the data might exist, but it could be owned by a company or be protected by an organization, and actually getting access to that data can be the hurdle.
Yeah, I'll say I sort of have like more of a general response, and then I'll give a specific example. So, generally we track in our office the impact that we have on the clients that we represent using data. We report it out to our grant funders, we report it out to the federal government that provides us with funding, and it really helps us figure out how we're impacting people, in what ways. It helps us set our priorities for who we're going to represent in what types of cases. So every time I have, I represent individual clients typically. Every time I have an individual client and I've gotten something for them, I've prevented their eviction, or I've gotten them a judgment against their landlord for $5,000 because their landlord failed to repair the property. We track that in our case management system. And then at the end of the year, we can go back and see, okay, how much were we actually helping the community with what we were doing, which is really useful just in a general sense as legal aid attorneys. Now, in sort of a specific example, so at the beginning of the pandemic, the attendees may recall there was a federal law that was passed called the CARES Act. And the CARES Act had a bunch of different components to it. It provided a bunch of money to the states. But one of the things that it did is it prevented certain types of evictions from happening, specifically evictions from federally subsidized properties, or from properties that had a connection to like a federal mortgage. So even if it was a private owner that was renting their home, if that home had a federal mortgage attached to it, like you might have heard of an FHA mortgage, then that owner was not allowed to evict that tenant during a certain part of the pandemic. It was specifically at the beginning, and it ended in, I think, mid-August. We had, the first thing that happened is folks started calling us saying, my landlord has filed an eviction. And we had this problem immediately of having to figure out, okay, well, who's your landlord, and how do we know whether your landlord is one of the ones allowed to file the eviction or not allowed? So we used a national database that was set up by an organization called the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. And they essentially created this entire database of all the properties that either had a federal subsidy attached to them or a federally subsidized mortgage. And it wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. So we were able to use that database to check against our clients' actual addresses to see if that home was covered. One of the things we found, though, is that there were certain types of properties that weren't in that database, but also were still prevented from filing evictions. Specifically, they were properties where the landlord had taken a Section 8 voucher. So a Section 8 voucher is like this, it's a subsidy that a tenant has that unfortunately is only available to about a quarter of the people who qualify for it. But you have to be a low-income tenant. The federal government pays a part of your rent, and then you pay the other part based on your income. So these housing vouchers, any landlord that accepted those vouchers was prevented from filing evictions during the CARES Act. But we didn't have a database of who those landlords were. So what we did is we sent out Open Records Act requests, which is, it's a really awesome tool that people use when they want to get data from the government. So the state has a law that says essentially that any government agency, with some exceptions, has to share their information with the public. So what you do is you put in what's called an Open Records Act request, and you say to that government agency, I want to see these records. and they have to give them to you. They have to give them to you pretty quickly. I think they have 3 days. And if they don't give them to you, you can file a lawsuit against them for failing to give you this information. So what we did is we went to each of the local housing authorities, public housing authorities that are essentially like quasi-governmental entities. We went to all of them around the Atlanta area and asked them for the entire list of all the landlords that had taken Section 8 vouchers or had accepted Section 8 vouchers. We then used that information and basically one by one put it into a spreadsheet so that we could check against that spreadsheet. And we used this to essentially prevent a bunch of evictions that would have otherwise happened. So, you know, a lot of our courts were shut down during the pandemic, but landlords were still filing these evictions. And the CARES Act said that they had to dismiss those evictions. So we got a ton of evictions dismissed using this tool between that database that we had from the national organization and from our own internal database that we checked against. And I had a particular client that I represented, actually 2 clients with the same landlord. The landlord kept ignoring the CARES Act, filing evictions. They filed, I think, 3 different evictions during the CARES Act. And I represented these 2 clients for almost a year. We didn't get the final order in the case until April of 2021. And at the time, essentially, the whole time we were arguing to the landlord, you can't file this case. It's protected under the CARES Act. And the landlord kept ignoring us. They went forward with the case, and we got an order from the judge in April, about a year after the first case, that said not only did the landlord not get to evict them, but also they didn't owe any rent from the time that the landlord had filed the eviction. So basically got a free year of rent, in part because the landlord had also failed to accept rental assistance. So the judge was pretty annoyed, let's say, at the landlord. So we got a great outcome for those 2 clients in that they didn't lose their homes, and they also got, a huge debt that they would have otherwise had basically was wiped away through the judge's order. So that's one of the ways we've used data recently.
And that's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing, and also points out all of the complexities within just housing in general, of being able to understand the laws, understand especially during the pandemic, where things have been changing with regards to eviction very quickly and are changing differently on the federal level versus the state level versus the city level, and trying to keep track of that in and of itself is almost like a data mission. I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to let Sarah talk about the work with the Atlanta Regional Commission and creating the Atlanta Region Eviction Tracker, and because that's been a dashboard for a way to look at evictions that are happening in the Atlanta metro area. And so I was hoping you could talk about why that was created, and then also I know that there's been some data difficulties with Fulton County and getting access to data, and if you could go into that some.
Sure. Well, I guess so. I moved from Atlanta Legal Aid to the Atlanta Fed January of 2020, and at the time we had this bright intern named Pierce Haley who was talking to me about some of his work that he was doing. He was a master's student at Georgia Tech, and he'd developed some code to pull court records from the I think he was looking specifically, I think, at Fulton and possibly also DeKalb, because he was looking at some City of Atlanta stuff, thinking about Atlanta schools and the school attendance eviction connection. And so he had this code and he was like, I don't know, maybe we could use this somehow. And I was like, yep, I think we could use that. Like, let's figure out exactly how we want to do it. And then the pandemic hit and it was like, all right, let's put that into action immediately. So we kind of had this code that he wrote, and he and I went, initially we actually talked to Alora Raymond at at Georgia Tech, who had been one of his mentors and who has done lots of work around evictions and rental housing and affordable housing more generally. And we were just sort of talking to Alora about, well, how might we stand this up? And, you know, like the Fed has all kinds of resources, but also rules and ways we do things. And then Georgia Tech has its resources and rules, the ways they do things. And so, you know, just that cross organizational discussion of how are we going to do this? What's the best place for it? You know, how are people going to access it? You know, and how big should it be? And so we started out thinking, let's start this with Atlanta. And at the same time, I had been having lots of conversations with the ARC around concerns about rental housing stability, renter stability, households that were, you know, suddenly losing jobs, and what were they going to do? How are they going to pay rent? You know, this was all happening probably during the months of like March and April and maybe into May, right? So the CARES Act that was enacted in March, and so that had kind of gone into place, but no one really knew how long it was going to exist for, you know, for certain. And the protections, at least for renters, and for the limited, as Lindsey pointed out, limited circle of renters who were protected and who may or may not have known that that protection existed. So I kind of reached out to the ARC and said, you know, actually Eric Woodworth, specifically because I had been in a training that he'd done about, you know, data and visualization and that kind of thing. And I'd been like, Eric, and so I asked him if he was interested in this project, and he was just like bright-eyed about it. So we decided that a really good place for visualization of the data that we were going to collect would be the ARC. You know, that's one thing you kind of have to think about with using data is who are you trying to get it to, and how are they going to understand it, right? Because if you send like a 1,000,000-line spreadsheet to a legal services organization, there probably isn't somebody there who is going to know what the heck to do with that, right? And so you have to figure out, like, well, in our capacity, in our resources that we have gathered, what can we do? Do we need another partner? And where should this go? And how should it reach people? And so we all thought that ARC was the right place because people were already connected to them, already looking at them for information about regional issues, including housing. So that's where it was housed. And also very wonderfully, Eric had the skill set to build the dashboard pretty quickly. And so with Tech's help, we automated the scraping system, right? So basically, we automated it and expanded it to the 5-county area, and set up the whole system and got it plugged in and announced its launch in, I think, like September 1st of 2020. And we were very proud of ourselves because it was like right around the time when the CARES Act had been expiring and we were ready to see what was going to happen. And then on September 18th, Fulton County decided to remove addresses from the HTML on their website. And that was what we were using to understand where these evictions were happening. And part of our visualization was not just how many are happening in a county, but where are they happening in the county? And the reason that information is important is because, you know, let's say you've got a lot of money to keep people from getting evicted. You might want to know where people are getting evicted. And of course, this is to say eviction filings are not the ultimate indicator in who is getting evicted. They're just kind of the only indicator, right? People get evicted and the case never goes anywhere. And that, you know, Lindsey would call that an illegal eviction, probably, you know, depending on circumstances. Other people decide to leave because they know they can't pay, right? And so all of that is displacement, right? All of that is destabilizing. And the eviction tracker, that just tracks the subset of those that go through the court system, right? And so we wanted to know, where is that subset located inside the county, not just Fulton County, not just DeKalb County, but where, what neighborhoods, right? And the addresses, that's the information that gave that to us, and still gives that to us for the 4 counties that we have them. So Fulton County stopped providing that address information, and we were unable to break it down into census tracts, which was how we had decided to do the breakdown, mostly so that we could do deeper analysis in the composition of those census tracts and understand, I mean, maybe understand a little bit more about who lives there and who's being impacted from using ACS data from well, actually, not just to understand who, but what the ratio was, right? So what we track is the percent, the rate of eviction filings, and how we do that is the number of the filings for unique filings, and the numerator, and the denominator is the number of occupied rental units. And the place that we get that number, that occupied rental units number, that's ACS data, and that's broken down by census tract. So that's the geography that and this is all for the data folks in the crowd. Like, this is always the kind of question, is like, does the information you have talk to the information you have in, are the geographies the same? Can you make them the same? What can you ask? What can you say? How reliable is it? So we chose census tract because that jives with the ACS data, and also gives us the ability to have insight into composition of neighborhoods, right? What is the racial composition? What's the income breakdown? What kind of housing is there, generally. So we had that all set up, and then Fulton County pulled the address information, so we couldn't do any kind of analysis on hotspots or anything like that for about a year. And we still released a report where we projected, we extrapolated based on data we had. Folks are welcome to read the report. But now actually we have the census tract level data again. We don't have it because the court gave it to us. The courts we asked them, please, could you put this back up? Why did you take it down? And they said that they were implementing a policy that they had, committed to prior to the pandemic. So there's been no movement as far as I think it's the court clerk's office that makes that decision, and not the magistrate court or a specific judge, to my understanding. But I don't have a lot of information other than what I have already shared. But Fulton County, the division in Fulton County that's working on their eviction prevention using ERA funding, emergency rental assistance funding, found value, has access to those records, and found value in sharing it at an aggregated level at the census tract. So we don't get information on individual cases from them, but we do have the aggregation, so we can put them back in our map level system and talk about hotspots and that sort of thing, which is helpful. There's a lot of analysis under the category of things I wish I had that I don't. There's a lot of analysis we could do with address level information. Specifically, we could understand a little bit more about what's called serial filings, right? So that's when a landlord repeatedly files an eviction against the same person at the same address. And this has been interpreted by other researchers who study, such as Matt Desmond, who study evictions, and have for quite some time, as a collection practice, right? Like, basically in states where this is easy to do, or relatively inexpensive to do, like Georgia, where you don't have all kinds of notice requirements and whatnot before you file an eviction. It can be it's the way that they notify a tenant that they need to pay rent, and it's it's a pretty heavy stick to hold over somebody's head, because that then impacts their ability to find a place to live otherwise. If an eviction's even filed, that can really impact somebody's ability to apply to live somewhere else, and so we can't do an analysis of those serial filings until we have address level data, because we can't know whether evictions were filed against the same address over and over again. We could do that pre-pandemic, and for the first what, 6 months of the pandemic, but not after that point at this time for Fulton County. We certainly can do it for the other. I think now we have 5 counties, and we actually are collecting data from a few others as well. And I haven't gotten those up on the dashboard quite yet, but yeah.
I wish this is so interesting, and I wish we had more time, but to get into this, we're also having some interesting questions come in the Q&A. I want to before we go, I know that we have students who are attending, and students have asked ahead of time. They wanted to know about what you would have done, like if you could have done something differently when you were a student, realizing that you would be in the position where you are now. What's something that you wish you would have learned, or like a course, maybe it didn't exist when you were a student, but a course that you could take, related, that would help you feel more confident or help you using data within your field. Is there something that you wish you would have done, or you would suggest to current students who are, want to work as a lawyer, work as a journalist, or work in government, or work in research? I'll start with Stephannie.
Yeah, I know journalism schools, they often do provide data journalism classes now, which is a pretty specific thing. I'm not really sure what courses, are provided in other fields that I'm sure would be super relevant to journalism, because there's so much crossover. I think, for me, it's hard because I feel like I learn best. I learn data skills best when I'm doing a project or something that's relevant to them. I feel like there's a lot of things I've learned in the abstract and then don't really, if I don't apply them, I just kind of forget them. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that I maybe in a course where you would learn how to do them, and you'd have a lot more time to focus on them than, journalists often get like an hour-long training session on how to use Excel or something, and that's supposed to help you for the rest of your career. So I'm sure courses would be super helpful, and there's so much need for data journalism, and those jobs I think are, there's a lot of news agencies looking for people who will do that. So having that in your background would really help if you're interested in that.
Lindsey?
I would say I took a statistics course in college, but I think it would have been nice to take one that had like a practical connection to it, sort of like Stephannie was saying, something that's actually connected to a specific project. If those types of courses don't exist, I would say getting together with a professor that does interesting work using data and asking to be their research assistant or do an internship with them, I think would be really great. I wish I had done that more when I was an undergrad, because I think part of what you don't realize until you sort of start getting into it is, what somebody else's job looks like, especially what it really looks like to do that job. You can't really see it until you're there. So I think internships are great for that, or research projects. And then I would just say, this is not really connected to data, but as a lawyer, I think without a doubt, and almost really in any job you will need to do, being a good communicator is incredibly important. So both in writing, like being able to write coherently, and also a good oral communicator. There are not many jobs that don't require that. So I would say any classes that really focus on those types of skills would be useful.
And Sarah, is there something you talked about, like being able to find people with skills to do that? Is there something that you wish you would have trained in, or that you're currently learning that you think that students should try to do while they're still students?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I was going through my like largely liberal arts education, and then like plowed my way into a law degree, and then did like a humanities, graduate school experience, humanities and social sciences, I'll say. I was very much like not a math person or whatever, and I was sort of like, oh, math, haha, left that behind. And now it's like laughing at me. I'm actually like good at math and like went to a special math high school, but I would say like even if you don't think that data is necessarily going to be the center of your career or statistics, take intro level stuff that will give you literacy in it, give you basic terms so that you can communicate with people who do that, right? Like you don't have to be the person who does all of that, but you do have to be able to, in order to access that knowledge, you've got to be able to walk that bridge. And so I think that having a little bit, I wish that I had stayed on more in touch and more on top of that literacy element. For sure. I think that's like the most basic thing I'd say. Otherwise, I'd say like learn how to code, you know, like learn all the codes, learn Python, like learn how to write scrapers. That's like incredibly useful stuff. And just, you know, explore it because it's probably more relevant to what you're interested in than you realize.
Sorry, sorry for that. I could not unmute, and so that was a problem. But I want to thank everyone for joining us. We have so many great questions that we didn't get to have time to get to, and I apologize for that. I wish we had more time. As you mentioned, if you are interested in building your data skills at the GSU library, we have workshops. If you go to lib.gsu.edu/data, so here's that website. You can find out about workshops. They have workshops on, you know, web scraping and how to use Tableau and things like that. So if you're interested in building your data skills, that's a resource for you. I also want to tell you about, if you want to find out more about Padlet and our programming, if you're a student and you're interested in forming or joining a Padlet student organization, we have a form that you can fill out. If you want to sign up for an email list, you can also go to that same link to fill out the form. We'll also share this on our Twitter later today, so if you don't have time to write this down. And we are going to continue having conversations about housing inequity for our Data in the ATL series. So in November, we're going to discuss data challenges in the fight against homelessness, which is often directly related to evictions. And so kind of continuing this conversation. And then next week, we have an event discussing data literacy as a tool for social justice. So if issues related to housing inequity and racial inequity is something that you're interested in, I encourage you to join us for that. And we'll also be hosting a panel discussion about the intersection of beauty and data. Again, I just want to thank everyone, thank our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our attendees. If you have any questions for Padlet, you can email us at padlet@gsu.edu or check out our website or our Twitter account at getpadlet. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye.